Hey, what's up? Manik here, and today I'm answering a question from Trevor Fickner. So, the question that Trevor had was about a how-to guide on starting shooting film. Instead of just leaving a response in the comments, I figured it'd be better to just make a video that is a definitive how-to guide to get you from 0 to 1 in terms of shooting on film. So to get started, there are only a handful of things that you'll need to know. There are only a few key steps, and once you can understand these, you'll have a pretty good time. So when it comes to shooting film, there are 5 things that I consider. 1. Film stock. 2. Shooting. 3. Developing. 4. Scanning. And 5. Processing. So let's start with film stock. When it comes to film stock, there are a few different types. Overall, the thing that the film stock is giving you is the ISO, which is the general sensitivity of the film, and your color. It's going to set the default color profile that you use to create your look. Ultimately, we do have some flexibility in post, but a lot of the time people choose a specific stock to get them much closer to their desired look. Actually, there's one more thing I forgot. The dynamic range. Different film stocks have a different dynamic range. They'll let you shoot in different conditions. Some films are a little more narrow, where you have to be very accurate with how you expose your film, whereas films with a bit wider of a dynamic range, they allow you to shoot in more varied conditions and recover or have access to more of the image after you shoot it. In terms of my favorites, I prefer Kodak Vision 3 500T, which is a cinema film, and Portra 800. When it comes to shooting on film, it's very similar to shooting digitally. There are only a few things to manage. So the main things that you're going to be looking at managing are your aperture and your shutter speed. The shutter speed will dictate, of course, how much time the camera exposes the film, or in a digital camera's case, the sensor. The aperture dictates how much light is hitting the sensor through the lens. So the aperture of each lens is different. There are different blades, and that creates different effects on your image. But ultimately, you're either dealing with an aperture that is wide open, that lets in more light, or closed down, which lets in less. The other aspect of shooting is using a light meter. This is a light meter. Mine is made by Sekonic. It is a 758 Cine model. So the thing about a light meter is that you get a reading of what you pointed at, or what you measure it beside. Also, inside of cameras, there are light meters. So it will tell you usually if your image is over or underexposed, depending on the ISO that you have chosen. The ISO, of course, is dictated by the film stock that you'll be using. What I do is I just meter for the shadows, typically. Film does really well with overexposure, but it's trash with underexposure. I mean, not really trash, but it doesn't capture information when it's too far underexposed. It kind of fogs out. The thing about highlights on film is that because you're working inverted, if you're going to the brightest part of the image, you are still reaching down into the tone of the film. So you have a lot more room in overexposure on most film stocks. Digital cameras work in the inverse, where they typically have more detail capability in the shadows, but need their highlights to be protected. And when it comes to metering and measuring my shots, I tend to expose for the shadows. I want to preserve as much room in the shadows as possible. So I choose that bias. When I'm shooting digitally, and depending on the camera that I'm shooting with, I vary that up a little bit, but that is a custom choice. You do have a lot of flexibility to change things as you go. The next step is developing. I typically just leave this to the lab, but there are ways that you can do this yourself. That's not really my style. I prefer to not deal with all of the chemicals and the back and forth to handle that at my house, but you can do that. There are definitely a lot of people who have come up with amazing tutorials and tools to make that process easier. In my case, I just leave it to the lab. They handle it, they develop it. Also, because I'm using motion picture film, it's a bit more of a process. There are different aspects of the film that have to be treated a certain way. Also, Kodak Vision 3 film cannot be developed in normal labs. So if you get your hands on some, be very careful and ask in advance to see where it can be handled for you. The next step is scanning. So scanning can be done a few different ways. I have the lab that I go to, which is Downtown Camera in Toronto, scan the film for me. When they scan the film, I have them scan it as a negative, like leave the negative alone. When converting or inverting film and processing it, assigning colors to it, the labs can sometimes have a bit of a bias. They can scan film their ways, and depending on who's touching your film, you may get a slightly different result. I prefer to scan it myself at home, or have them scan it as the negative as it is, so that I can do my own post-processing. I can invert the film and I can get it to look the way that I like. Also, as a side note, I'd recommend doing some split tests when you're going through this process. I took a few rolls and I had them scanned at my lab both ways, and then also scanned them myself using my Fujifilm X-T3 with a macro lens. And I also used a little light box. There's a way to do that. I may do a tutorial on that. There are also tutorials online already for that, so you may not need it. But basically, you can scan using your digital camera at home, or you can have the lab scan your film for you. I prefer having them scan it for me, so that I can get an initial file that's quite large, and then I can process it myself. And the last aspect is processing. You're going to take the film that you have scanned in, and you will either invert it or color grade it to make sure that it displays what you want. Initially, I try to work with a negative that has as much information as possible. I learned this also while shooting digital. I've done some split testing of that as well, where I decided to see how over and under exposure would work, how different types of scanning methods would work, see how different types of film stocks themselves would work. And eventually I figured out a process that works for me. I also have an entire video about this, so if you'd like to see that, there will be a link in the video, possibly somewhere. I don't know. I'll link it up here. Down there, I'm checking my screen. It'll be somewhere. It'll be on the video. When it comes to processing my film, there are two bits of software that I use. I use Capture One when I'm scanning in with my Fuji, and I also use DaVinci Resolve. So at times I will do a base inversion using Capture One, or scan them in and use that software linked to my Fuji to do a live shoot, so that I can actively go through all of my negatives very quickly, and then I export them and bring them into DaVinci Resolve to further grade. So there you have it. Those are the 5 steps that I take when shooting film. I always keep this in consideration. Basically, the main things to look out for are underexposure. Overexposure matters too, but underexposure is usually the main culprit. Metering effectively, choosing your film stock wisely, and understanding your tools. Getting comfortable with the camera that you use will ensure you have better and better results. And I think that it's best to say, take a camera that you want to run with for a while, find a lens combination. I prefer prime lenses, but zooms are great for travel as well. And just going through the motions over and over again. Pick a few rolls that you like, run some tests, test the dev process, test the scan process, test the post-correction process, and get familiar. Overall, as much as I could tell you here, the biggest difference is made through actual hands-on experience. So get out there and have some fun. As a side note, if you found any of this useful, feel free to subscribe and to pass this video on to anyone who you think may benefit from it. And that's it for now. Manic out. Peace.